Well, thanks for the opportunity to join the class and give this talk today. I am sure that there are many in looking around the audience that would prefer that I be talking about the results of the consent decree negotiations and report to you exactly what has occurred and the results of that. Would anybody prefer to hear that instead of my talk today? Raise your hand. I hope that it will be someday very soon when we can describe for the community all of the progress that has been made and the progress that will be made in the future in terms of the priority soils consent decree and the hill cleanup. We're very excited to look, and we're looking forward to that day very soon. But for the time being, I agreed with my colleagues, Eric and Julia, to pinpoint one particular angle of restoration, remediation on the Butte Hill, and that is the nexus between the cleanup and land use. Of all the contributions that have been made by so many people in the room that I see over the last 3 decades of the cleanup effort, the one aspect that I take particular pride in for my own contribution is the land use piece, and to always think about how property is going to be used in the future while you're designing. When you're doing the design of a remedial action or a restoration project, how the land is going to be used in the future. And that's the focus of my talk today, and I'll try to leave as much time at the end for questions as I can. Just the quick basics of the cleanup effort in Butte. It's pretty simple. It's all about water and soil. And our 3 main goals, and when I say our, I mean everybody's goals over these last many years, is to eliminate human contact with the waste and make sure that human health is protected. Secondly, we have to eliminate contact with waste sources from rainwater, stormwater running off and onto these sites. And third is to do our level best to figure out how we can stop water which carries some of the mine waste, particularly copper and heavy metals, from reaching Silver Bow Creek. Our residential metals abatement program has been the stalwart in terms of the program we run as it relates to eliminating human contact with contaminated soils. We've run that program since the mid-1990s. More than 1,500 areas have been addressed, and it has been largely successful of eliminating contact with soil and dust in the home on that human level. As far as the source areas, number 2, regarding the caps, there are some 178 locations throughout. The blue line is what's called the priority soils operable unit. That's the hill cleanup area, and each of the green polygons represent an individual location where mine waste is or was. Some of it's been removed, much of it has been capped, and the responsibility in the forever is to make sure that there's no contact between the mine waste below and the rainwater that might hit it. And thirdly, a system of channels and ditches and catch basins have been installed now to collect the storm water, to route it to areas where the metals can drop out, and then the clean water can continue on down to Silver Bow Creek. Overall, I think the project has been largely successful to date. We have several very important aspects of the cleanup to finish before we can consider it ready for long-term maintenance. But you know, in the old days when I started in 1991 as opposed to 1999, we had the guys who ran our Metro Sewer Treatment Plant, and The whole Superfund thing was just getting off the ground, and you know, I was told coming in, I actually took on my Superfund coordination responsibilities at that time, and the guys who run the plant said, you know, when it rains in Butte, the whole Summit Valley goes toxic. That the amount of metals coming off the hill back then led to fish kills and a dead stream that was Silverbow Creek. And I think we all can be very proud today, some 28 years later, that largely the major contamination sources have been eliminated and do not reach the creek anymore. And we still got work to do. We still got a few more set basins to build. We've got some water to get out of water's way in terms of the groundwater. We have some sites as related to these sites that I talked about. A couple dozen weren't done as well as they should have been, and a couple dozen more weren't done at all, and those all got to get done as we move forward. But largely, the cleanup piece has been completed. But today, if we could just set aside all that remedial talk for a minute, and I'm here mostly on behalf of the students of the restoration class, to drill in to the instruction the necessity to consider land use. That the priority soils, as you can see where all of these capped areas are, and combine that with all the homes and the yards that have been remediated, here we are, we have a densely populated municipality, basically a city, that is scheduled for cleanup, and here we are going to do what? Just clean it up and then just leave the land for no use? Or are we going to ensure that that land is accessible, number one, and can be used for a community purpose after the cleanup is complete? Butte-Silver-Bow established a vision that no project is complete or successful unless the land that has been remediated or restored can be used and is used for a community benefit. And there's another variable that has been front and center of our efforts on the Butte Hill all these many years, and that's the piece on historic preservation. We had a colliding laws in the early 90s where the top priority was the environmental cleanup of our environment, but at the same time there were many historic resources on the hill, principally all of the mine yards that we wanted to preserve. We wanted to preserve that heritage. And there is a law that says that you cannot execute a federal action, in this case the environmental cleanup, and adversely impact an historic resource. And as many of you know, Butte and its wondrous historic resources, they're everywhere. And so there was a conflict, and it was our responsibility to make sure that, yes, we had to complete a few seats up front here on the right. Come on up and sit down. But we put together this Regional Historic Preservation Plan in 1994, and that was meant to, again, bridge the necessity to preserve historic resources and at the same time do the environmental cleanup job as it was intended. And that gave rise to this notion that land use and environmental cleanup have to be done as a pair. It can't be done separately. So our vision was to be the best and the most shining example of an adversely impacted area that transformed itself through the remediation and restoration projects that were set forth. Now, the three main tenets of our vision and our philosophy as a community, and particularly as a local government, are outlined as you see. There's a couple chairs up front here for you guys. Please do come in, especially you young people who are going to have to lead us into the future. But there's something strange happened on the way to environmental cleanup, and that was the local government being named a responsible party for the cleanup. And by that, the PRP, potentially responsible party. So we're named as a responsible party to implement the cleanup. And what did that mean? Well, for us, it meant first and foremost that the community and the taxpayers, or the ratepayers of the water and sewer rates, they should be insulated from the costs of the remedial effort. Secondly, we have to do right by the resource, and that's what I talked about first. We had to make sure we eliminated exposure to this mine waste and kept our waterway clean and protected from environmental degradation. And third, and this is where the talk comes in, we wanted to limit the restrictions on the land in the after situation so that it would produce a community benefit. So those three tenets form the basis of how we approached each and every cleanup project that was advanced in Butte. Now, the first and most shining example of our philosophy was the Tullamore housing project. And Julie, maybe you want to come up and show how this was in the past. But this area here, phase 1 of the Tullamore project, and phase 2 over here, used to look, if we zoom in on how it looked in the past, we're zooming right into this area. So this is what we found. This is the way it looked not more than 30 years ago. This is Empire Street. This is the Syndicate pit area, correct? Yeah. And this is what it was. And so along comes Superfund, and it's time to clean this up. And we said, well, what's it going to look like when we're done? Well, it's going to look like any other mine waste source areas. You know, we're going to get as much of the waste as we can near the surface. Then we're going to put an 18-inch cap on it, and then we're going to leave it as an open field. Well, that was not acceptable. That wasn't good enough because we got enough open fields in our environment. So instead, we decided that what we ought to do is transform it into some housing projects. So phase 1 was the 12 lots right off of Empire Street, and phase 2 was the 12 lots in and along Idaho and Montana and Missoula. This is the way it was. What was the date of this?
1955.
1955. There were some houses there, but several of them had been removed, and this area was an absolute mess. And so we said, how about housing? Oh, no, we can't have housing because this was a mine waste area. And we said, well, yeah, but once we are going to remove the mine waste near the surface, shouldn't we find a place for what turned out to be, this was phase 2, but what turned out to be a joint project with the National Affordable Housing Network. Each of these houses and 12 houses among the old houses along Missoula Avenue use super insulation technology. These houses were built as affordable houses for our low-income folks so that the operating costs were next to nothing because of the way they were constructed. But from an environmental cleanup, the idea was once the cleanup is complete, how about using that land? And as we'll see, besides the housing project, then we said, well, we got to have some recreational areas. And then this particular area long had been the Missoula Gulch ball field of the Little League, and it was a windy, cold place with really very few amenities. And because this area, Missoula Gulch, was slated for remediation to route stormwater, as I said earlier, to the catch basin, which is the old Syndicate pit, we said, well, while we're doing that, how about we retool the existing ball field, rebuild it with some better dugouts, and a concession stand and bathrooms. And while we're at it, let's build a second ball field, and let's connect the ball field through a trails network for community benefit. And so what was really one of the worst areas that needed to be reclaimed under the Superfund project became then home to several lots that then were developed for affordable housing, a recreational piece, and a trail system that connected this with some of the other amenities on the hill. This was a project that took a lot of convincing. The thinking at the time was, you know, for those of you who know Superfund very well, there are 7 criteria that are used in determining a remedy. There's 2 threshold criteria and 5 what they call modifying criteria. Anticipating and thinking about land use in the future wasn't one of them, and still isn't today. But projects like this in the mid-90s were, as they were set forth by communities who wanted to do better by their town, gave rise to a change in philosophy at EPA. And now land use, you've all heard of the brownfields to greenfields grants that they give away, and the whole mission of taking brownfields and making them ready for reuse. So housing and recreation and open space are a couple of the land uses you think of in the future while you're designing the remedial project in the present. The next example, well, we talked about the Missoula ball fields. This is the ditch before we started along Missoula Avenue, and now looking in the opposite direction, looking west, we were able to get that capped. It still functions as a ditch that conveys stormwater to the syndicate pit, but now it just looks a lot better and complements the little guys in the and the Little League baseball players. Another project that was really the beginning of this philosophy was right along Mercury Street in Butte. I hesitate to do what Julia just did, so just trust me that this looked, you know, really bad. This was literally right up from Mercury Street, from Arizona to Continental Drive. And the old Colorado mine was there, and along comes Superfund. Oh, well, we got to cap this site. Well, what's it going to look like when you're done? Well, it's just going to look like one of these capped areas. Well, in this case, the land was owned by what was called at the time the Continental Public Land Trust, which was a holding company for a lot of the parcels that were transferred from Inland Properties, a subsidiary of the Washington Corp. And along comes Aware. These are really in capital letters, not be aware of property, but the company Aware, they were willing to take a chance. They were the willing buyer and the seller, and in return for getting the land very cheaply, for next to nothing, the site was remediated, the mine waste was taken out, and then Aware built this and a second building on the site. And now today, some 30 years later, or 20 years later anyway, it serves a very specific and community benefit purpose as one of the several buildings that Aware has reused and rehabilitated both in Anaconda and in Butte. Here's an example of a property that would have otherwise just been left as an open lot with a fence around it, and now serves a community purpose. And the better, and even a better benefit is that instead of now having to worry about making sure the cap is sustained in the forever, well, now we've got a commercial use, we've got a beneficial use on the surface, and just as a part of them taking care of their property, they are essentially maintaining the cap for that acre or two on the corner of Mercury and Ohio. Another example is the project that took the Colorado Tailings, put them on top of the Clark Tailings, and created this park. If if you recall, and you'd been in Butte, or you'd been born, some of you, by then, back in the 90s, this is what our front door looked like in Butte. This was the Colorado Tailings area. The old channel of Silver Bow Creek ran along this area, and those Colorado Tailings had to be removed. First idea, put them on a rail car and truck them to Opportunity. That lasted about a year and a half, and they had gotten, there's 1 million cubic yards that needed to be moved. Probably 40,000 was done in the first couple years. And at that rate, it was going to take the better part of a decade to get these Colorado Tailings out of water's way and to a safe repository, and then we could start reconstructing the channel as it looks today. So Butte Silver Bow was approached. Actually, Butte Silver Bow actually was so the next thing that had to happen was the Clark Tailings. And now we're up here on Timber Butte. Why don't you come up, Julia, and get back to that other tool we have. Up on Timber Butte, this was the old zinc mine, and the Clark Tailings needed to be remediated. So the idea was, let's take the Colorado Tailings, just get the Clark Tailings and the Colorado at the same time, maybe go out a little bit. Okay, so the Colorado Tailings were here along the riverbed, and we made a decision to truck them all out of there. We brought them underneath the railroad. We brought them along the railroad easement on the west end of the cemeteries, and we buried them all over the Clark Tailings, because they had to be capped anyway. So and this is the way it looked in '55. The Clark Tailings were just exposed mine waste along Grove Gulch, which runs right through here to Blacktail Creek. And the Colorado Tailings were a mess. As our front door, the interstate was built, and the first thing you see going through town was this mess. And so we said, well, why don't we, instead of trucking them all the way, or training them all the way to Opportunity, why don't we bring them down, put them on top of the Clark Tailings, and get a beneficial use for the community out of the project. And then what we got was the Copper Mountain Recreational Youth Complex at the surface, and we got a reconstructed channel along Silver Bow Creek as it is today. And then we built the lagoons, and other things came later. But now we're close to getting the rest of that done, as well as a trail system through there, and the beneficial end use here at the bottom, where once was just a complete wasteland. So that was another project. Why don't you just stick around here? So back to the slides. The action was in 1998. It was born and raised by this community. This community said, hey, it's taking too long to move those Colorado tailings. We want an end use. If you're going to cap the Clark Tailings anyway, we want something to be able to do with that property when we're done. And that's the result of that project today. And now, subsequently, we built the Miners Field just in the last couple years, which is probably now one of the best, if not the best, American Legion baseball field in the state. And it all certainly was made, in this case, the land was made available because of the decision we made to build the Copper Mountain complex, and then the generous donations we received since then to build the Miners Field. We talked about the Lower Area 1. Another one that will show that looks better on the other thing is the visitor center. People who, particularly, if you in the last 20 years ago, this was a municipal dump in the confluence area. This corner between the KOA, which is there now, and the Blacktail Creek and Silverbow Creek coming through here, and you can see what Silverbow Creek used to look like. This triangle was a wasteland. And again, this was actually where there was, in the old days, a community landfill facility. And that's what it looked like circa 55, but really, and by the early 90s, it didn't look much better. And so again, it had to be remediated under the Superfund project. Now we're going to take care of the rest of the deal. As you can see, this is before there was an interstate coming through here. And now we're going to work on the rest of this. This is the Blacktail coming through, and then this is the area today that is got to get fixed before we're done with the area. But this area, this triangle right here, became the visitor center, and it allowed us to do two things. One was to take an area that was contaminated and get it remediated and turn it into a visitor center when people come off the interstate. But it also serves as one of 5 gateways under our Regional Historic Preservation Plan. This one is for the gold and silver gateway, and as you go in today, there's still a lot of the artifacts on the north wall which try to interpret some of the lost historic resources in the environmental cleanup. But another example of taking a remedial project and turning it into a community asset. One of the last ones we have to show is the railroad corridor. And again, going back to the 55 photo, the corridor that is the B.A.M.P. trail. Some of you may remember throughout most of the 90s, there was actually a tourist train that ran through town from Rocker up to the Kelly, turned around, went back, choo-choo, the whistle, the whole 9 yards. Here was the conundrum. As long as it was a railroad, it needed to be cleaned up only to industrial standards, which means nothing, no cleanup, because it already was meeting the industrial cleanup standard. Well, it goes right through several neighborhoods, you know, including Montana Tech here, you know, on around the campus, and then points to, and this is the way it was back in the day, all the way to the Kelly mine. Well, it was an environmental catastrophe. I mean, going right through these neighborhoods, that's the way it was back in the day, that the people lived right next to where they worked in several of these mines, and we faced this problem. The remedial effort was standing still because we as a community decided we wanted to use it as a tourist train. Well, if it's a tourist train, it's an industrial use, that's a railroad, which means that's the cleanup level. Well, that was unacceptable. So what we decided to do was to get a clean corridor and change it from a tourist train to a pedestrian trail. It was one of the first Rails to Trails project that the National Surface Transportation Board approved in the United States. And Butte Silverbow acquired all the land. If you go back to the old 55 photo, all of the corridor was made up of mining parcels that the railroad had patched together to create a corridor for the train. So what we did was we took all of the parcels, put it into public ownership, made our application to the Surface Transportation Board, because it's a very tricky thing changing a railroad corridor to a pedestrian corridor because there's no going back. And then we worked with other grant sources and the Superfund process to build what is now a real, okay, do the overlay, what is now a real attractive corridor, pedestrian corridor that includes the Anselmo, connects the Anselmo, the original, up through below the mountain con, all the way over to the Kelly. And so this corridor now very popular. Everybody loves the trail and the trail system. All the result of the community working together to parlay the environmental cleanup agenda with the end land use and the purpose that we wanted for the long term. The next and last one we have is the Granite Mountain Memorial, and this is probably the most striking of the photos that we have with our 55 thing, and that is this whole area. Before you go, oh, that's okay.
Oh, sorry.
No, the entire area, this is the 55 thing?
It can be 55.
Yeah, so, this was a veritable wasteland. Just go a little further east for us. So the Granite Mountain Memorial proper is up from the Kelly. It's about, why don't you give me the other one? Okay, so the Granite Mountain Memorial is right here. Okay, and so you can see that the large swath, starting with the mountain con, up to the Bell Diamond, to the Granite Mountain, the Speculator, and the Pilot of Butte, this was a veritable wasteland. And they basically said, oh, we're just going to cap it and be done with it. Well, the historic preservation community says, really, we want to keep our eyes on exactly what used to be in this area. But when you turn around and look west from the memorial, we want it to look decent. And we want to be able to use that area for some public purpose. And that gave rise to what was called the Granite Mountain Memorial Interpretive Area. And as a result, for the community's willingness to leave this area as it is, the extra funds and the extra effort was made to put the trail system through here, to create Foreman's Park, build the pavilion, the bathrooms, and give us a very beneficial end use of this area, and then the trail system and the completion of the memorial. The memorial was a funny story in 1996. This is before brownfields to greenfields were popular, or before it was cool. Senator Baucus called and said, hey, there's some leftover money at EPA. Maybe we could get a brownfields project going in Butte. What do you think you should do? And several of us in town, led by Jerry Walters and the organization that was the memorial, said, well, we could get this memorial off the ground. And then the first rule came up under Superfund. You can't put a brownfields project in a Superfund area. It's against the rules because it's a Superfund area. Can't do it. And with the power of Senator Baucus and the fact that we were ready for the idea, the first $50,000, we had to share the $100,000 with Anaconda and also Deer Lodge. And some of the money that was used in the area at the Garrison Junction there's an old plant there that still provides a challenge for the community in Deer Lodge and that area. So we were one of the first in the country to certainly use brownfields money in a Superfund site, and then 10, 15 years later, we finished the project in 2011, finished that. But just to give you that flavor for how it looked just 20 years ago, and then how it looks today, and how we made it our business to make sure that when the remedial effort was done, that we were left with a legitimate community amenity and public benefit. And so that's what I got. The final thought, particularly for the students who are designing projects and going to lead us into the future, that as you're designing these projects, as you're thinking through how the remedial effort, which is the highest priority to make sure that the resource is protected, how you design that project so that when you're done, the community you're working in, the project area of the site delivers a public benefit to the community and a public asset that they can use long into the future, and again, provides an incentive to take care of that remedial effort forever, rather than leaving it to somebody to go and make sure the fences are in place and the debris is picked up and the cap is in good shape. If there's a public benefit, the community takes care of that benefit as part of the long-term maintenance effort. That's what I got for you.